TV stations in the 1960s really knew how to write a catchy jingle.
Pack up your troubles and forget your cares. Pack up your family and head for the fair in Seattle.
In 1962, Seattle was hosting the World's Fair, an entire event dedicated to predicting what life would be like in the 21st century.
Welcome to the future and all the wonders of the 21st century in the greatest preview the world has ever seen.
The Century 21 Expo predicted an exciting future of monorails, space needles, and a spherical elevator called a bubbleator, which featured a very spooky voiceover.
Please step to the rear of the sphere.
One of the exhibits was a full-scale model of a 21st century home, and, well, it's pretty much just an ordinary 1960s house, but everything is curved. Curved walls, curved tables and chairs, curved bed for some reason. Even the roof had kind of a Timu Sydney Opera House design. So they like things big and curvy, fair enough. But a few years later, a similar exhibition in San Francisco took a very different approach.
This kitchen of tomorrow, for example, which is about to make all Australian housewives positively sick with envy.
The kitchen of tomorrow looked like a cube with a circular table in the middle, but the walls were made of various moving panels, which would extend, retract, or flip to reveal all the appliances and surfaces needed for food preparation. The fridge doubles as an oven somehow, and the dishwasher is hidden inside the dining table. It's all very exciting and surprisingly economical with space. But the one thing they never talked about in any of the predictions was the eye-watering price tag of these future homes. Fast forward to now, and these kitchen oracles got a few things wrong. Homes aren't particularly curved, and there certainly aren't any secret dishwashers hidden in the dining tables. Here in Australia, we're in the middle of a crippling, decades-long housing affordability crisis with no end in sight. But this is a crisis that's actually been on the horizon for decades, and along the way there have been serious attempts to fix it. So how did it go so wrong? I'm Matt Bevan, and from If You're Listening, this is Black Swans, a series about how, despite our best efforts, predicting the future is almost impossible. This episode is about the great Australian pastime, talking about housing. And we've been partaking in this pastime for a while. And we know this because we've found an incredible treasure trove of letters addressed to us, sent by prominent Adelaideans from 1959 as part of an ABC project called Letters to the Unborn. And they too spent a great deal of time speaking about housing.
You can know everything about us, except perhaps why we think and act as we do. If you're interested at all, it won't be, I think, in the sort of homes we built, but in why we let them sprawl over miles of our loveliest country.
I assume houses and flats have gone on diminishing, getting smaller and less complicated every year. Do you really live in a thing not much bigger than a couple of our phone boxes? Is this personal box really convertible to a kitchen or a bedroom or a bathroom according to your need of the moment and your own thought, selection of the fixtures, furnishings and gadgets that you want?
Not quite. Although I seem to have found myself in the loading screen of the Matrix, so I can probably manifest a kitchen at a pinch. Now, even if housing affordability wasn't being discussed around the kitchen table as much in the 1950s as it is now, the changing market trends were certainly a hot topic.
When we were young, people were often born in the same house that their great-great-grandparents had been born in. As we are now, families are selling off old homes right and left. People use their homes as wives use their hats.
Home ownership was very important, and people expected to start very young.
As a younger fellow, home was always very important to me as a teenager, and later on as I became engaged to the girl next door. And I hope that the home will hold exactly the same needs in the heart of my children as it held for me as I grew up.
But where were all these families with so many kids going to live?
And so today, the people of our towns have to put up with the discomforts of unplanned, overcrowded cities. Cities which have outgrown themselves.
In the 1950s, nearly half of Australia's population lived in its 4 largest cities, and that number was growing every year as more and more jobs shifted into Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But those cities were not even close to being ready for that amount of growth. Poor town planning meant that living conditions for a lot of people were not ideal.
And thousands are forced to live in cramped and sombre houses in our boundless sunny land.
This was more than 65 years ago, and yet apparently nobody's fixed the problem. Let's check in with modern-day economist Shane Oliver to see where things are at now.
Our rough estimate is that we've got a shortfall of Australian homes of somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000 dwellings.
So, how come this is still a problem? Well, in the 1950s, the debate was over whether cities should expand upwards or outwards. High-rise apartments or even more sprawling suburbs. One of our letter writers was convinced that by now we would have settled that debate.
I'm glad to see that you're no longer suggesting that the ordinary man and wife with his young family should live an unnatural life in a concrete box on the 10th floor of an apartment building near the centre of a city. You've done with that.
Yep, all done. No families living in apartments here. The fear of families living in concrete boxes en masse was so strong that some cities were attempting to tackle the housing supply issue before it became a bigger problem. One of those cities was Adelaide. At the end of World War II, Adelaide was in the middle of a battle against Brisbane for the title of Australia's 3rd largest city. That kind of implies that it was big, though. It really wasn't. Its population was about 380,000, so smaller than the Sunshine Coast today.
Adelaide, built on a site chosen and surveyed by Colonel Light 112 years ago, is now a garden city with broad streets and city squares.
Turning it into something more than that would be difficult. Adelaide is a very long way from anywhere in particular, and Adelaideans tend to agree.
Is Adelaide one big party town?
No, it's a dead, boring one-horse country town.
Okay, thanks for sharing that with us.
But the Premier at the time, Sir Thomas Playford, was determined to attract large industries to his state.
South Australia, before the war an agricultural outpost, was now industrially on the map. Sir Thomas Playford came along and spearheaded the boom.
Sir Thomas, who ended up being Premier for nearly 30 years, was a bit of a force to be reckoned with.
Assisted by favourable decentralisation policies from Canberra and incentives offered to them by Playford, the manufacturers headed west.
One of the key promises that he made to manufacturers was that if they moved their businesses to South Australia, they would be able to pay workers lower wages. But that created a paradox. More jobs in South Australia means more people will want to move there.
In the late 40s, 50s and early 60s, population grew here at a faster rate than anywhere else in the country.
More people wanting to live in the city drives up house prices, which will mean people want higher wages and you're back to square one. Playford's solution was to build as many houses as humanly possible.
In South Australia, it was a really unique approach. They saw housing as a source of revitalising their state economy. And so the Premier at that time had decided that industry and manufacturing was the way forward for South Australia. And so housing and affordable housing for workers was key to that.
And it was important that those new houses were going to comply with the Australian dream.
It wasn't just about producing good quality housing, but also a good quality citizen. So they needed to be moral, devoted to democratic ideals and not seduced by socialism. And so for that reason, the standalone home with a garden was considered to produce that kind of citizen.
Only commies live in apartments. To realise his utopian capitalist vision, Playford created the South Australian Housing Trust and put our letter writer, Alex Ramsey, in charge.
Somebody well before your time, my dear descendant, decided that the main question was the location of work, because this always provided the reason for people living in one place. As soon as this was realised, factories and offices were located so that the houses of those who worked in them could be built as close as possible.
So you spread out the factories and offices over a large area and you build homes so that people who work there can live nearby. This was, in fact, Alex Ramsey's life's work. It was the purpose of the entire South Australian Housing Trust.
So the intention, very focused, was to build cheap, good, cheap worker housing, therefore reduce the costs of labour in South Australia and draw industrial development to the state, which worked very well.
And Ramsey's magnum opus was this.
Elizabeth, South Australia. To you perhaps just a name, but to us here in South Australia, a city, the newest planned city in the Commonwealth of Australia.
It was a city built by the Housing Trust outside the state capital of Adelaide, intended to decentralise jobs and create more affordable housing options for young families.
Elizabeth was, this new vision for the state of South Australia.
This is not how cities are usually built. Generally, they grow around some sort of resource or a transportation hub. Industries grow, creating jobs and attracting population growth. They're not just artificially planted somewhere just because the land was cheap. But by the time Alex Ramsey was writing his letter in 1959, the city had reached a population of around 15,000, and he expected it would grow even larger.
17 miles north of Adelaide, Elizabeth is established on the main Northern Highway, only half an hour by road or rail service to Adelaide, only a few miles from Gulf St Vincent. Designed on a vast scale, 10 suburbs and 3 industrial areas each radiates out from a large town centre. A town with a target, a city of 50,000 people by the late 1960s.
The Trust had built 4,000 homes in 47 different designs, all of which were available to buy from the Elizabeth Information Centre, seen here in this promotional film produced by the Trust.
Oh, this is attractive, Bob. I like the porch idea.
Looks nice and light, too.
How about this one?
Yes, I rather like that. But I think this is perhaps more in my style.
They've all got nice big windows, haven't they?
Hang on, just play that back again. Are we seriously calling these windows big? I mean, maybe those ones, but the rest of them, I don't know. Look, it's 1959, and the concept of a nice house was quite different to today. Demographer Bernard Salt's parents grew up in a similar type of house to these ones in Elizabeth.
They thought all their Christmases had come at once, of course. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, outside toilet, or lavatory as it was called. A quarter-acre block, 1,000 square metres. Mum and Dad, 6 kids in our household, so bunk beds, the whole shebang.
8 people sharing 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom seems more like an Australian nightmare than an Australian dream, but it was better than an apartment.
Well, I don't think we'll have any trouble finding a really nice home in Elizabeth.
And this is what Elizabeth promised to provide.
So 1,000 houses a year they were constructing at Elizabeth. So that did have a depressing, if that's the right word, effect on housing prices in South Australia.
Alex Ramsey's plan wasn't just to dump a bunch of houses out in the middle of nowhere and hope that people would move in. He wanted the city to be self-sufficient.
They got a lot of powers from the government to build factories, to build halls, to build schools and neighbourhood centres and so on. By the 1960s, there were 23 churches there, 19 factories.
Now, jobs. What's the employment situation like? Are there any big firms close by?
I thought you'd ask that.
Yes, because it was in the script.
You'll find that in Elizabeth, the factory areas have been planned close enough to the houses to be convenient, but of course, not too close.
Employment opportunities were looking good. At the time, car manufacturer Holden was in the process of moving its massive factory to Elizabeth.
South Australia attracted Holden to Elizabeth with the offer of cheap land and power, along with a willing workforce paid a modest wage, but given subsidised housing.
Electronics, packaging and tractor manufacturers followed suit. I mean, all that sounds great. There was also a fireworks factory and an asbestos pipes factory, which sounds less great, but Premier Playford was thrilled.
Large factories have been established. A very large city indeed has grown up. Population of some 25,000 people. A very pleasant place to live in has been established. I believe that the people of Elizabeth are very happy people indeed.
On paper, Elizabeth looked like it ticked every box.
I'm delighted to find that Elizabeth has grown into such an attractive and thriving community.
And while Premier Playford got most of the credit for the success of Elizabeth, he insisted that the credit belonged to his housing trust boss.
There is no one who was more responsible for the successful establishment of Elizabeth than Mr. Alec Ramsey.
Under Alex Ramsey, South Australia had the highest rate of construction per capita in the country. Elizabeth was keeping the Australian dream alive, but it wasn't just Elizabeth. There were similar satellite cities in development around every major Australian city.
It's all part of the development of Campbelltown as a satellite city. This will be West Melton, Melbourne's first planned satellite city, a city in which everything has been thought of in advance.
Would it work? Well, everyone certainly hoped so. After all, something needed to be done about housing supply. Australia was experiencing an unprecedented population boom. The baby boom was well underway and tens of thousands of migrants were arriving every year.
And people from many different lands have made a new life in Elizabeth. After all, life goes on in much the same way here as it does in other countries.
Although when they say many different lands, they really only mean one in particular.
There's an English family in this street. They've made a good job of their home and garden too.
Nearly 50% of the population of Elizabeth were English immigrants. It was the highest concentration of ethnic people in Australia at the time.
Those that weren't English were often Scottish.
I was born in Glasgow, but I grew up in Elizabeth, which is a satellite city outside of Adelaide.
Yes, that's Jimmy Barnes, and yes, that's Mahalia Barnes too.
And they sort of tended to stick a lot of the immigrants here in the 60s when they brought them over for 10 quid. So it was a fairly sort of rough and ready sort of joint.
At the time our letters were being written, Australia's population was officially 10,060,003. Except it wasn't. Look at the top of that table. Excluding full-blood Aboriginals. Of the people we could be bothered counting, less than 1% were born somewhere other than Australia, New Zealand or Europe. For context, it's 21% now. Australia was, constitutionally and by force of bipartisan government policy, a racist country. The immigration system operated under the White Australia policy, which enjoyed bipartisan support in Parliament.
We have no bitterness and no resentment against other people, but we can't be expected to solve the overpopulation problems of the world.
Our letter writers felt pretty strongly about the burden of an increasing population. We explored that in the first episode of our series. Some of them actually referenced the White Australia policy directly.
I know I would like Australia to stay white in an overwhelmingly coloured world. I may be offending you in saying this.
You may very well be. They were concerned that invasion from non-white countries would destroy Australia's national characteristics.
Not that they're all good characteristics, good Lord, no. But they are our own. They mean a good deal to us now, and he thinks that they'll mean even more to us in the years to come when every country will be fighting to keep its beliefs, its culture, its way of life from being drowned in a uniform sea.
Of course, by your time, there will be little of the Australiana as we know it. Our northern neighbours will have absorbed us long ago, peacefully if not by other means.
Among our letter writers, there were several who were opposed to the White Australia policy, but even they had a very 1959 way of talking about it.
The younger generation, at least, has begun to accept the fact that black, brown or yellow may be as good as or better than white.
How absurd this must seem to you, distant reader, for I suspect that you're a half-breed of wonderfully mixed inheritance. Perhaps rather like the fine people who live in the Philippines.
But for now, the fine people being brought to Elizabeth were white. The question is, was this grand idea to build a satellite town successful?
Yes, I think it was. It drew thousands of people to South Australia. It drew factories to South Australia, or helped underpin factory, industrial and commercial development. Elizabeth was very much a man's industrial town in that sense. It was a very gendered as well as class created town, basically. And it was a great deal of prejudice, really, formal prejudice against married women working.
This didn't sit well with the migrants flooding into Elizabeth, who had come from a far more progressive place.
So the English women were much more accustomed to work outside the home at that point than Australian women.
But there were no jobs in Elizabeth for women. They'd have to travel to Adelaide, but the two cities weren't well connected by public transport and driving was difficult.
They assumed that women wouldn't actually need cars.
So it became a company town, where everyone living there relied on a small number of large, foreign-owned factories for their income, which worked well, until it didn't.
No matter how successful a state instrumentality or even a national government is, as we all know, if international capital decides it doesn't want to invest anymore, it doesn't. Simple as that.
Like hundreds of other Western industrial towns, when investment dried up, the jobs started to disappear and the middle-class families started to leave town.
And the young in particular seem to be going to places like Sydney, which, with its phenomenal growth in recent years, is absorbing and even taking away more and more of the service industries.
Alex Ramsey died in 1978, and his replacements were less aspirational in their town planning. They started using Elizabeth as a place to house low-income families.
What that meant was that you had increasing rates of unemployed living at Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth therefore became much more of it's a phrase that gets bandied about, more of a ghetto with people who were really struggling.
This is an area where you've got third-generation families where nobody's ever worked.
The final blow was when the Holden factory, which had brought so many jobs to Elizabeth, closed completely in 2013.
This is really a very disadvantaged area to begin with. It's got real challenges, and this has just dealt another significant blow.
As Australia entered the global free market, areas like Elizabeth were left behind.
As tariff barriers that protected manufacturing were gradually pulled down, Elizabeth has morphed from workers' housing to welfare housing to wasted housing.
By 2025, the city had been largely absorbed by the Adelaide urban sprawl, so Elizabeth isn't really a separate city anymore. It's one of the most disadvantaged parts of Australia. Crime rates are high and school completion rates are low. And sadly, this situation in Elizabeth isn't unique. Most attempts to plant new communities on the peripheries of large cities have generally failed. At best, they've become commuter suburbs where most of the population must travel vast distances to their jobs in central hubs. At worst, they become centres of high unemployment that can feel very hard to escape. These days, if you were to visualise the Australian population as 100 people, 20 would live in Sydney, 20 in Melbourne, 10 in Brisbane, 9 in Perth, 5 in Adelaide, 3 in the Gold Coast, 2 in Newcastle, the Sunshine Coast and Canberra, 1 in Hobart, Darwin, Cairns, Geelong, Toowoomba, Townsville and Wollongong. And the other 20 people, well, I guess we just have to chop them up and scatter their organs across the rest of the country. Sad, yes, but statistics is a dangerous game. To accommodate those non-dissected people, big cities began to abandon the Australian dream in the late 80s.
Federal Housing Minister Peter Staples says our cities are sprawling and it's time to get rid of the traditional Australian concept of the quarter-acre block.
Our cities, instead of spreading out across the landscape across the horizon, effectively, we've got to start developing more medium-density housing.
Medium-density housing, so smaller properties and smaller homes. Perhaps the future really was that cube kitchen with the retractable dishwasher. Or, as experts were predicting in the early 90s, maybe no kitchen at all.
Really what we're on about for the next 50 years is getting families to outsource all the services, which means that you don't make goods at home and you don't do any services at home either.
You don't cook?
You sure don't cook. I think that's on the way to being a museum piece in a home. And because very clearly with two income earning families, the idea of going home to do a third and a fourth job for husband and wife just isn't on.
It turns out we just cop it. Phil Riven spent the following decade or so making predictions that conditions for young families were going to improve.
Residential real estate prices going through the roof the way they are. Do you see an end to that?
Yes, I do.
First of all, the end of the price rises, I certainly do. I mean, you've now got a situation where in Sydney you're paying 9 times an annual male's earnings to get into a house.
9 times, eh? Let me just check where that's up to now.
Today it's about 14 years in Australia, so there's been a dramatic deterioration.
Thanks, Shane. Back to Phil Riven in 2003.
It's obviously ridiculous, and we will see a fall of about 15 to 20% at the top end of housing, and that'll make it a bit more affordable again for the first home buyer.
I think I need a beer. Let's see if I've got one in my combined fridge oven. Where did the Matrix put that kitchen?
But the more interesting thing, I think, George, is that the younger people won't want home ownership in the same way that my generation did.
Oh boy. Well, the statistics would tell you that home ownership indeed has become a lot less common.
And home ownership, in fact, peaked in the mid-1960s at around 73%. So in other words, 73% of Australians were living in a home that they or their family owned. Of course, since then, there's been a dramatic decline. It's now down to around 63%. But I think the basic driver is a lack of supply relative to underlying demand for housing.
This series is called Black Swans, and so I've been looking for all the black swans that caused predictions of the past to be wrong. In this case, people expected that someone would ensure that Australians would be able to live in affordable houses. The unexpected thing was...
Government has not responded appropriately.
All Australians want to be able to afford to live somewhere nice without having to travel for hours every day to get to work. But millions of Australians, many of whom are in couples where both partners have good, high-paying jobs, still can't afford to buy a home. And for the last few decades at least, governments haven't really tried all that hard to help them.
As high house prices have become more and more embedded in the system, there becomes a political dynamic that sees that accentuated. Because don't forget, you've still got around just below 2/3 of Australians either own their own house or are paying it off. They don't really want to see house prices fall. And this increasingly includes millennials. It's not just baby boomers like me and Gen X, but it's increasingly millennials.
Wait, hang on. Am I part of the problem here?
So as they get into the property market, they've paid those inflated prices. The last thing they want to see is a big fall in prices.
You know what? He's right. Just ignore everything I've said here. That's my equity and you can't have it.
So consequently, politicians have not been as focused perhaps on addressing the issue as they should be, and we've seen this affordability crisis continue and in fact get worse and worse as the years go by.
During the pandemic, I moved to a regional city from a capital city because I could no longer afford to live there. Since then, I've mostly worked from home. For a while, I truly thought that people working from home en masse would finally allow the decentralisation we'd all been looking for all this time. But now there's a strong push to wind that back.
But we've also required that all federal employees must once again show up to work in person like the rest of us.
There is a drop in productivity. There is a drop in mentorship. There is less of a sense of joint mission.
We've said 3 days a week. And for our very senior leaders, it's 5 days. There's no way you're building a career in this organisation working from home.
Look, I know there has been a push to come back to the office and there's good cultural reasons for that and I can understand that, but I think you've got to get the balance right here. It would be easier to decentralise, and if we had the infrastructure, you could still live in the Blue Mountains or even at Orange. If you had a very fast train that would get you back to the city for your 1 day a week, that would probably work.
If the government isn't going to introduce policy to make houses more affordable, they could at least make it easier and faster to get around. What if you could live in one city and be quickly transported to another one for work? Our letter writers of 1959 assumed that by now we would have all that sorted out.
You all commute daily and hourly so fast through space in your private flying saucers, spaceships, time and space equalizers, or whatever you may call them.
And yet we don't. In fact, we travel at almost the exact same speed that we did in 1959. Why is that? Where's my private flying saucer? Where is my time and space equalizer? We'll look into it next on Black Swans.